In the mid-1980s, Colonel Gaddafi and his entourage of militant Arab revolutionaries challenged the West from his stronghold of Tripoli. To America and Europe, he was public enemy number one, the most important sponsor of international terrorism. The same man in July 2009. Yesteryear's enemy was now one of our own. A distinguished guest at international summits. A ruthless dictator became an ally of the West. An ally who, 17 months later, would use tanks and artillery against a popular uprising in his own country. How did the West make its peace with Muammar Gaddafi? The answer is a tale of violence, duplicity, and realpolitik that goes back 40 years. The relationship between Gaddafi and the West began in a revolution. Backed by a handful of officers, the then 27-year-old captain toppled the corrupt but pro-Western monarchy of King Idris. In his first public address, Gaddafi challenged the two powers that dominated Libya.
في ليلة مجيدة لتجعل كلمة الحق هي العليا وكلمة أعداء الشعب هي السفلى. إن الشعب الإنجليزي يدرك تماما إن قاعدته باتت في حيز العدم بعد ثورة الشعب الليبي، ونحن ندرك أيضا إن الشعب الأمريكي الذي يحتفظ بقاعدة فوق أرضنا.
The first day of the revolution, a couple of Range Rovers drove up to the U.S. Embassy. They said, "It's time for you to meet Brother Muammar." He shared the Arab view that our objective was to maintain client states throughout the region, using our military bases and using economic aid and other inducements.
Gaddafi told the American diplomats that the giant Wheelus Air Force Base and its 5,000 airmen were no longer welcome. The United States lost a strategic base in the heart of the Arab world, but it did not break off relations with Gaddafi, far from it.
We recast our policy to downplay the importance of the military bases, to protect our economic relationship, and since this was a Cold War period, to do what we could to prevent Libya from offering some kind of special access and military privileges to the Soviet Union. I think he saw value in having some kind of relationship with the United States as long as Libya was not in a subordinate role.
Libya remained very important to Washington. And not only because of geopolitics. Beneath its soil was the 6th largest oil reserve in the world, with American companies taking pride of place. But the rich, strategically located nation was now in the hands of a revolutionary. A revolutionary who was nonetheless quick to grant an interview to CBS.
You say it's not peace. You are an anti-communist, yes?
Yes, of course.
Yes, of course.
We are against the communism, but we are not against the friendship of Russia. If it is a mere friendship, noble friendship.
You have no intention of nationalizing ESSO. You have no intention of nationalizing Occidental?
Should not be worried about ESSO and Occidental and
Why?
other. Because we nationalized Libi for political reasons, you see?
Yes.
We hope this reason will not happen in the future between us and America.
Gaddafi's shrewdness was rewarded. Between 1969 and 1971, the CIA helped him fend off several attempted coups. Once rid of his rivals, he could rule with an iron fist. Gaddafi's first foreign visit was to see Egypt's President Nasser, his model and the idol of all Arab revolutionaries. Gaddafi fervently embraced Nasser's ideology: Arab unity, the struggle against Western imperialism, uncompromising hostility towards Israel and its chief ally, the United States. Like Nasser, he wanted to wipe out the humiliation of the Arab defeat in the Six-Day War with Israel. When Nasser died 3 months later, Gaddafi proclaimed himself his true political heir.
There is a figure emerging in the Middle East, we're told, who could become a new Nasser. At least he is a man with those pretensions. He is Colonel Muammar el-Gaddafi, 30-year-old ruler of Libya, and he wants to unify the Arabs, exterminate Israel, and restore the Arab crescent of nations to their ancient prestige and power. If those ambitions seem grandiose for the young leader of a desert land of a mere 2 million people, it should be quickly pointed out that Gaddafi has one powerful asset: money. He may be, in effect, the world's richest man.
To carry out his plan, Gaddafi unexpectedly turned to a Western country.
Au moment où le nouvel ambassadeur arrive, il va remettre ses lettres de créance. C'est annoncé dans les journaux, parmi les petites nouvelles ordinaires. Le nouvel ambassadeur de France remet ses lettres de créance. Une foule énorme se masse sur notre passage, et donc la clameur s'élève. Il paraît évident que le pouvoir n'a pas organisé véritablement cet attroupement, mais l'a favorisé.
Gaddafi had a good reason for seeking closer ties with France. He wanted to make his military the most powerful in the region.
La modernité occidentale, pour lui, reste une espèce d'outil à acquérir. C'est quelque chose qui manque, en quelque sorte, à sa panoplie. Très vite, il voudra acquérir des instruments très visibles de cette modernité, à savoir des avions de combat.
We knew that the French were interested in replacing the Libyan U.S. aircraft inventory with French aircraft. So it was clear that the Libyans had the idea of balancing off different countries and not being too dependent upon any one.
On a foggy day in November, Gaddafi landed at Orly airport to sign France's biggest ever arms deal, an order for over 100 Mirage fighter bombers. In exchange, he insisted on being received in Paris. His first official visit to a Western nation brought him worldwide recognition. He had a lengthy meeting with President Pompidou, but the visit did not go well. Demonstrators protested at the sale of modern weapons to a man seen as unpredictable and aggressive.
الرئيس بومبيدو يمثل القيم الفرنسية الحقيقية ولا بد من التفريق بين الحقيقة التي يمثلها الرئيس بومبيدو وبين غوغائية الشارع أو غوغائية الصحافة أحيانا.
On met une arme redoutable entre les mains d'un fou comme on le prétend. Là, il trouve ça affligeant, il trouve ça ridicule, il trouve ces accusations complètement déraisonnables.
For Gaddafi, the visit was a humiliation. Around the world, the press mocked the would-be hero for harboring delusions of grandeur.
Il va entrer dans le personnage dont on l'affuble. On a l'impression qu'il a été suffisamment blessé pour rétorquer à cette espèce de rumeur internationale qui l'accusait de folie, pour rétorquer que, eh bien oui, je suis excentrique, je suis fou, je ne suis pas comme vous. Et vous allez voir ce que vous allez voir.
Eccentric and ambitious. Gaddafi tried to form a pan-Arab state with Egypt and Syria and even Tunisia, with himself in charge. His pretensions to leadership ended in a falling out with the other Arab states. Libya didn't even take part in their next war against Israel. It too ended in defeat, finally putting an end to the dream of Arab unity. Then came news that sent a shockwave through Libya. Egypt, under President Sadat, Nasser's successor, made a separate peace with Israel, and it did so with backing from Washington. This time, Gaddafi swapped his military uniform for the mufti favored by Palestinian guerrillas.
Can you present a real alternative to Sadat here?
Why you speak also about Sadat? Who is Sadat? We speak about the Arab rights and the Palestinian people, how to restore his land, how to establish his state on his land, how to liberate their country.
Disappointed and rejected by the Arab states, Gaddafi had found a new cause. In Tripoli, he welcomed Yasser Arafat of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and leaders of the PFLP, the spearhead of Palestinian terrorism. From then on, he used his enormous resources to fund armed struggle.
If you take perhaps the most deadly of all the Palestinian groups at that time, the Abu Nidal organization was established in Libya. And Gaddafi had made a habit of supporting or appearing to support terrorist groups from all over the world. Particular interest to Britain, of course, was the IRA, the Irish Republican Army.
We had satellite photos of training camps in Libya. And these were not military training. They were guerrilla training, training people how to go around blowing up things and that sort of thing.
For 10 years, Gaddafi sponsored some 30 terrorist groups, ranging from Germany's Red Army faction to Carlos the Jackal. They struck Western targets accused of supporting Israel. Gaddafi also had the dubious distinction of being the first head of state to send agents to the West to assassinate his enemies.
We lived all in fear at that time. We had to be very careful who we meet, who we talk to, Sometimes we have even to use nicknames. So we had to be very, very careful because it was a dangerous time.
When we used to say to the Libyan diplomats in London or to our Libyan contacts, how do you justify this? What are you doing? How can you be carrying out these acts? Their attitude was, this is not terrorism. We are punishing some Libyan criminals. We're doing it. If they're in Libya, we do it in Libya. If they're in Britain, we do it in Britain. But you needn't worry about it. It's nothing to do with you because we're not going to hurt any British people. It's just Libyans that we're hurting.
In April 1984, Libyans firing from an upper window of their embassy in London wounded several anti-Gaddafi demonstrators and killed a young policewoman, Yvonne Fletcher. The British government, conscious of its oil interests in Libya, limited its response to expelling the embassy staff and breaking off diplomatic relations. But to the Libyans, even this muted response went too far.
And I saw somebody quite senior in the Foreign Ministry, and I said, my instructions are to tell you that you are no longer welcome in London. And as we had expected, they immediately retaliated, if you like, by saying that we had to leave within the same time. They weren't expecting it. They thought that Libyan interests were so important to Britain that we would not break off relations. And they were really surprised and upset and unhappy that we did.
Colonel, have you ever encouraged your men to kill your opponents overseas?
The Libyan people will follow these terrorists everywhere, and they have the right to eliminate them.
If Gaddafi now felt untouchable, it was because he had a powerful protector who showered him with honors on every visit. Since the end of the 1970s, he had been an ally of the Soviet Union, which sent him weapons and thousands of military advisors. On the chessboard of the Cold War, Libya and its terrorist networks made useful pawns to strike at the West. Terrorist violence reached a bloody climax in December 1985. Gaddafi's protege, the Abu Nidal organization, machine-gunned the El Al ticket counters in Vienna and Rome. Libyan intelligence was accused of supplying the weapons. Among the 20 dead were several US citizens, some of them children.
الإرهاب بكل أشكاله، ولكن أنا أرفض رفض قاطع أن يتهم العمل الفلسطيني بأنه إرهاب. إن العمل الفلسطيني هو أقدس عمل على الكرة الأرضية في هذا العصر.
The Rome and Vienna murders are only the latest in a series of brutal terrorist acts committed with Gaddafi's backing. Gaddafi called them heroic actions. I call them criminal outrages by an outlaw regime.
In Washington, Gaddafi had a new adversary, Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican who had promised to crush America's enemies. Tripoli made an easier target than Moscow. Reagan sent the US 6th Fleet to the Libyan coast and shot down several Libyan aircraft. But it would take more than that to make Gaddafi back down. 100 miles from the American fleet, he was inspecting his tiny navy. It was indeed better suited to photo opportunities than to battle.
They tried to scare us. عموما نحن لا نخاف وإذا كانوا يلعبوا فمعنى هذا أكدوا أن الكلام الذي قلناه وأن نريد أن يلعب بالنار وإذا كانوا جادين فنحن جادين.
It was all a charade. The Libyans knew that the United States would be reluctant to attack an ally of Moscow. In any case, the Americans themselves still held major oil interests in Libya. Gaddafi's ambitions won him more and more enemies. In Africa, he had threatened his southern neighbor, Chad, for several years. The Libyan army annexed northern Chad and built bases and airfields there. Gaddafi now confronted France, which backed the Chadian government. The crisis deepened. President Mitterrand sent a high-level negotiator.
Il m'a dit, vous savez, on vient me solliciter. Il y a quelques semaines, j'ai reçu des élus corses qui sont venus me demander des armes. J'ai refusé. Il alimentait la conversation sous l'angle, vous voyez, je fais des gestes pour la France parce que c'est la France socialiste. C'était ça, son idée. Il essayait de mettre un coin entre les Américains et nous, sous le prétexte que nous étions socialistes, donc, croyait-il, anti-américains, ce qui n'était pas le cas. Mitterrand m'avait autorisé à emporter des photos que nous avions prises, que notre aviation avait prises, des pistes qu'ils allongeaient. Car tout en discutant avec nous, il faisait allonger ces pistes. Et quand je lui suis arrivé, je lui ai dit, mais c'est pas loyal. Je suis sorti de ma scène, je lui ai dit, voilà les photos qui ont été prises tel jour. Alors, il a quand même été comme ça. Et il m'a dit, il les a regardés, et puis il a retourné, il y avait une date, il m'a dit, ah, je croyais que c'était des photos américaines. Je lui ai dit, non, ce ne sont pas des photos américaines, ce sont des photos françaises. Alors il a regardé la date de nouveau. Il m'a dit, tel jour. Ah oui, en effet. Il était très comédien. En effet, j'étais sur place dans le train, et je me souviens, il y a des avions qui passaient au-dessus. C'était probablement vos photos. Oui, très bien, mais j'accepte de discuter sur ces documents. Alors, il réfléchit. Et si je ne les arrête pas, qu'est-ce que vous ferez? J'ai regardé. Je lui ai dit, elles seront détruites. Je vous dis, nous les bombarderons, elles seront détruites. Vous n'oserez pas. J'ai dit, ne prenez pas le risque.
Gaddafi was wrong. The French Air Force was ready to destroy the Libyan installations in Chad. While Minister Dumas was returning to France, the Americans were urging the French to go further and bomb Gaddafi's palace.
Je suis arrivé chez Mitterrand à 2 heures du matin. Je n'avais pas mangé de la journée. Daniel m'a fait une omelette. J'ai vu Mitterrand était dans son lit, il dormait, s'est réveillé. Il m'a dit, heureusement que vous arrivez. Ah bon, et pourquoi? Il m'a dit, parce que j'ai reçu dans la journée un émissaire, Walters, qui était ambassadeur des États-Unis en Allemagne, avec une lettre du président des États-Unis disant, maintenant ça suffit avec Kadhafi, il nous mène en bateau. La bonne position serait de lui donner une bonne leçon, et le mieux placé pour faire ça, c'est la France. Les intérêts, le Tchad,
Oui, ils ont utilisé l'arme secrète qui était le général Walter, qui parlait une demi-douzaine de langues. Et il était une personnalité assez forte. Il parlait parfaitement bien le français. Il était connu en France. Le problème, c'est qu'on l'a envoyé en dernière minute, ce qui n'était pas du goût français, parce que les Français aiment bien qu'une préparation soit faite, une ambiance soit créée, Et ce n'était pas le cas.
I think if you want the French to do something, the last thing you should do is tell them to do it.
Bon, ils étaient venus me voir à Paris en me montrant des photos. J'avais une délégation de 12 militaires américains et ils avaient étalé toutes les tables, toutes les photos. Vous voyez ici, là, ce sont des établissements chimiques qui préparent des armes chimiques. Moi, je disais rien. Hein. Et au bout d'une heure, je me rappelle, je les ai cloués comme ça. J'ai dit, écoutez, vous allez m'expliquer pourquoi, si vous savez ça et que vous accréditez les éléments que vous avez, pourquoi, quand les Américains, les ressortissants américains arrivent en Libye, ce sont les seuls ressortissants qui n'ont pas besoin de prendre de visa avant. Expliquez-moi quand ils viennent pour du pétrole, pour des affaires. Ah oui, mais c'est pas le problème. Je dis, écoutez, c'est pas le problème, mais ça fait des années que ça dure. Alors, pour moi, c'est le problème. Ils étaient repartis tout penauds.
Gaddafi was safe. Commercial and diplomatic interests weighed heavily in the French refusal to settle accounts for Washington. But the colonel had only won a reprieve. For the global balance of power was shifting. The fate of Gaddafi had been on the agenda at a superpower summit in Geneva a few weeks earlier. Ronald Reagan had met the new Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev. With the Soviet Union in decline, a thaw was in the air. At the meeting, the two presidents discussed the struggle against terrorism. Moscow agreed to drop Gaddafi and deny him membership of the Warsaw Pact. The United States now had a free hand. But on the 5th of April, 1986, Gaddafi struck again. A Berlin discotheque, popular with American servicemen, was bombed, killing 3 people.
He knew what he was doing. He saw the United States, of course, as the main support for Israel. Therefore, he wanted to destabilize the United States. Of course, that would be impossible for someone like Gaddafi, but he thought he should do everything possible to fight the United States.
They're always trying to hide their involvement as a state, and it was fortuitous that we were able to intercept their communications to the Libyan embassy in East Berlin.
This monstrous brutality is but the latest act in Colonel Gaddafi's reign of terror. The evidence is now conclusive that the terrorist bombing of La Belle discotheque was planned and executed under the direct orders of the Libyan regime.
On the 14th of April, American F-111s took off from England to attack Libyan military bases, as well as Gaddafi's personal residence in the heart of Tripoli. They had to skirt France and Spain, which had both refused permission to cross their territory. It took 3 days to find out whether Gaddafi was still alive. When he eventually made a brief appearance, he didn't say a word.
It would not have been something that you wake up feeling guilty about at night if we had killed him. But that wasn't the main goal.
Le geste qu'a fait le président Reagan était réussi, que l'Amérique pourrait frapper fort et à distance. Et je crois que c'était absorbé par les leaders arabes, les autres leaders arabes.
People always accused me at that time, my diplomatic friends from other countries, that you were just picking on a little country. And I would say, well, you know, it's always good to make your point in a way, in the least expensive way.
Un homme comme Hafez al-Assad, par exemple, il a dû prendre en compte cette attaque et agir comme il faut.
The United States hoped that the strike against Gaddafi would deter other sponsors of terrorism, such as the Syrian President Hafez al-Assad and the Iranian mullahs. Gaddafi was stunned. Neither his army, nor his friends in the Arab world, nor the Soviets had been of any help. He posed as a victim, claiming that this child was his son, Khamis. He was stunned, but as threatening as ever.
أنا معمر القذافي نستطيع أن نشكل جيش أممي من المقاتلين ضد الإمبريالية وضد الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بالذات، وهذا الجيش سينتشر في جميع أنحاء الأرض لتدمير الوجود الأمريكي في أي مكان.
2 years later, a series of terrorist attacks shocked the world. In December 1988, a Pan Am flight exploded in midair and crashed on the Scottish village of Lockerbie. 270 people died. There was no credible claim of responsibility. Nine months later, a DC-10 of the French airline UTA was also destroyed by a bomb. Rescuers found 170 bodies scattered in the desert. After 2 years of laborious investigation with little to go on, the French and the Americans accused Libyan intelligence. The bombings were seen as Gaddafi's revenge on his French and American enemies who had both bombed Libya.
Well, we never talked directly about that, but I talked to other people, and the feeling was that this comes from his upbringing in the middle of the desert, where you have the philosophy of eye for an eye, you see. And in both cases, he felt there was justification.
Kadhafi, moi je lui en ai parlé, il m'a dit, bon, c'est pas la Libye. La Libye ne fait pas d'attentats, il ne fait pas de terrorisme, etc. Mais il n'est pas impossible qu'il y ait des Libyens qui aient été récupérés par d'autres services de terroristes. Possible qu'il y ait des Libyens. Donc, pour ça qu'il a reconnu une semi-responsabilité. Ça lui permet de sauver la face.
But there was another hypothesis, that Libyan intelligence had not acted alone. Two other states, Iran and Syria, came under suspicion as silent partners in the bombings, particularly in the case of Lockerbie.
I can tell you without any doubt that initially the understanding was that it was not Libya, but that it was Iran. Of course, I can't reveal to you the evidence I saw at that time, but there was evidence. It wasn't just speculation.
Well, it was under the tent, about 60 miles south of Tripoli, and it was a pretty perfunctory interview, and at the end I said, well, now you're going to tell me what really happened in Pan Am 103. I said, now's the time to, even if it's not for publication, off the record, but tell me what really happened as you saw it, as you understood it. And he said, well, and he dismissed everybody in the tent, and it was just him and me. And he said, well, you remember that the U.S. Navy shot down a peaceful Iran Airbus flying between Bandar Abbas and Dubai, and the U.S. Navy shot it down, and then the U.S. Navy claims it was a mistake. and they apologized, but retaliation, he said, had to be done. How does retaliation happen in this part of the world or in the Middle East? He said they obviously had to ask help from another country, a friendly service, so they subcontracted the retaliation to one of the Syrian intelligence services, and we all know there are about 14 intelligence services in Syria, so I don't know which one, and they then subcontracted to our own intelligence service.
If it had been the case that Syria was guilty of responsibility for Lockerbie, that would have been very embarrassing at the time when Syria became an important ally of the United Nations forces, America, Britain, France, and the other countries which took part in the Iraq war at the beginning of the 90s.
The West wasn't looking for other trails in the obscure world of terrorist networks and secret services. It had the perfect fall guy in the blustering Colonel Gaddafi.
The international community is sending two clear signals. First, that
This time, it was not bombs, but international sanctions that were to hit Tripoli.
that is prepared to make concerted
Libya was required to accept responsibility for the bombings and to turn in the agents responsible. Western diplomats believed that a drastic embargo would be enough to bring Gaddafi down. In 1993, Gaddafi celebrated his 24th year in power. The erstwhile revolutionary was now 50. Flanked by the few national leaders who were still willing to be seen with him, he pointed the finger at his old enemies, Britain, America, and France, to explain the position Libya now found itself in.
باعت نفسها للشيطان واعتقدوا ان الشيطان سيبقى دائما، لكن نقول ان الشيطان سيهزم في النهايه وسينتحر الشيطان.
But for now, Gaddafi was the one in danger. He was a pariah, leader of a country that was cut off from the rest of the world by an embargo on air traffic and weapons sales, and above all, by a boycott of its oil, Libya's only source of revenue. With the nation bankrupt, Gaddafi faced dissent from within the regime. There were several attempted coups.
For Gaddafi, there's one important thing for him: being in charge, being in power. Because if he loses his power, he's finished. And when I say finished, finished literally. So we are talking about someone who would do anything in order to stay alive, in order to survive.
To survive, Gaddafi needed money, diplomatic support, and oil exports. In short, he needed the West, especially the United States, the sole superpower of the post-Cold War world. It was a matter of survival, for in the vast Libyan desert, Gaddafi had found another formidable enemy. Armed Islamist groups with ties to Al-Qaeda were trying to oust his weakening secular regime. Like much of the rest of the Arab world, Libya faced the challenge of Islamism, which fed on economic stagnation and dictatorship. The colonel and the United States now had a common enemy. So he gave an interview to a journalist known to have ties with US intelligence agencies.
He said, you know, I want to work with the CIA. He said, I'm threatened by Muslim extremism, Islamist extremism, especially in the eastern part of my country, and I would like to cooperate with the CIA. And would you pass this message on? Which I did. Well, I called my friend Jim Woolsey, who was then head of the CIA. I knew him when he was negotiating the MBFR treaty with the Russians in Vienna. So I called him and I told him what had happened. He said, do you mind being debriefed by our experts? I said, no, of course not. So we met at the agency. There was about 14 people around the table. And when I told them that he was anxious to cooperate with the CIA, somebody said, do you trust him? I said, of course you don't trust him. Nobody trusts him. But if I were you, I'm not CIA, but if I were you, I'd test him.
You know, I don't really remember exactly when this offer was made. It was probably there, but we didn't take it very seriously. Again, as time went on, we became more concerned about the threat from Al-Qaeda.
Despite this non-response, Gaddafi approached the White House to open negotiations on Lockerbie.
You know, it was like he was knocking on every door and trying to see whether there was any window that was unlocked, and rarely would a week pass in those days, in those first 2 years that I was in the White House, when there wasn't somebody, a friend, usually a friend of the president's, from Arkansas, who was calling up and saying, you know, I've got a message from Gaddafi. He also used foreign leaders. At the beginning of an administration, a lot of our Arab allies come to visit. There were those various initiatives. They didn't seem to us to be serious.
Finding the doors and windows closed, the Libyans tried the chimney. They approached Washington lobbyists, including several who had been members of President Reagan's old team. Some agreed to plead Libya's case. Among them was Abe Sofer, one of the men behind the 1986 air raid on Libya.
Well, it was very clear why they chose me. They told me why. They basically said, we believe that the American people and the American government will trust you. They know that you bombed Libya, that you were part of the team that bombed Libya, and therefore you're the right guy. I said, the only way I would be willing to accept a representation of Libya is if you told me ahead of time that the purpose of the negotiation would be to satisfy the UN resolutions. And so then it came back, the answer came back, yes, we would.
In a Geneva hotel known for its discretion, Sofer had several meetings with Libyan officials.
When I met them in Geneva, and I met the head of intelligence, their intelligence service, I was even surprised at how clearly they felt that they were suffering as a result of the sanctions. In a more informal discussions, it was always about what do we need to do? You know, how do I establish a relationship with the intelligence service of the United States? How do we establish commerce again? What are the steps that we need to take? And of course, I told them the first thing you need to do is settle these resolutions.
Sofer informed his former colleagues that the Libyans were ready to agree to all the UN demands.
People I spoke to said, number one, they'll never do it. Number two, they're full of it. They're just misleading you. And number three, if you're right, we won't agree to it.
Our view of it at the beginning of the administration was that Gaddafi was essentially in a box. He was under sanctions, UN sanctions. He wasn't causing us any serious problems, and that it was fine to basically leave him there.
It was check, almost checkmate. On the 10th anniversary of the 1986 air raid, Gaddafi fell back on his usual theatrics.
يعني بعد المذبح هذه ما زالوا يتكلموا عن لوكوربي.
After this massacre, they talk about Lockerbie.
المفروض تخجل، ما عادش تتكلم على ليبيا.
America should be ashamed of Libya. America should not talk about Libya.
بعد هذه المذبحة نفاجأ بأن ليبيا متهمة مرة أخرى بلوكوربي.
After such genocide or massacre, we talk about, we find out that Libya is being accused again of Lockerbie.
But Gaddafi still had one more card to play, and it was an ace. He asked the American oil companies in Libya to send him an emissary. They sent a former ambassador who was well versed in difficult negotiations.
Well, my personal belief after 38 years as a diplomat was that we should never break communications with anyone. We should always be talking. And I even told Gaddafi this. I said that during the Second World War in Bern, Switzerland, we were talking to the Nazis. The head of the CIA was talking to the Nazis in Bern, Switzerland. So he liked that story a lot. I found it very friendly. And then he said, we want American business to come here. And he took out a map of the oil fields. And he says, you see all of these blocks in red? Well, I'm saving this for American companies, he said. They have the best technology, so we want them to come. So that's why we want to have normal relations with the U.S. We want American business to come back.
Gaddafi had been shrewd enough not to touch the American oil concessions, but the implied threat was clear. Come back before others reap the benefits. After 4 years of embargo, the Libyan oil fields were whetting business appetites. Italian, German, British and French businessmen were making regular trips to Tripoli despite US opposition.
As other countries, mainly European countries and companies, started to try to get into the oil drilling and export business in Libya, those companies, particularly I remember ConocoPhillips, became nervous that they would lose their drilling rights. And so they did start to press.
It wasn't just the oil companies. The new British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was close to President Clinton and to the British companies keen to renew ties with Libya.
I spoke to President Clinton in 1998. I said to him that I thought that, Libya was prepared to make a significant change, that it had taken another look at the world and decided actually it didn't want to be part of the terrorist movement. On the contrary, it actually wanted to be a partner. And it was worth investigating, that we should have a look at it. I mean, who knows, but let's have a look at it.
The Brits were knocking on our door constantly saying, why not test him? Why not try, call his bluff on this question of a trial?
Well, he's, as ever with Bill Clinton, he was, really open to examining it. I mean, he, obviously pointed to all the history and the difficulties and the challenges there would be, but said, hey, well, all right, if they're prepared to change, we're prepared to change too.
Once the British got involved, it was a concerted effort, what we in America call a full court press. It's a basketball terminology when everybody is in pushing to try to score the basket. What became I think the critical shift in the balance here was that it became increasingly obvious to those of us responsible for policy in 1997, 1998, that the effort to maintain sanctions in the United Nations was beginning to fall apart.
All kinds of pressures were coming into play. In 1998, after bitter negotiations, the White House agreed to a novel solution. A trial in the Netherlands with British judges and American rules. The defendants were 2 Libyan agents that Gaddafi had agreed to hand over.
We had convinced Gaddafi that it would be good to give up these people to be tried, and that the U.S. would not stab him in the back. That's what he was always afraid of. Will they stab me in the back? I will give away these people, and then they will continue sanctions and make it worse. So we persuaded him that wouldn't happen. The main thing that I was working on was to persuade Libyans that it could be done without destroying the power of the regime. The key people were the British. They made contact with him and said, we can make sure that once these people are given up, the UN sanctions would be lifting. And we speak for the US also, you see. So then he still wasn't, he didn't believe it until some of us, like myself, persuaded him that it was a true proposal.
We have, as I believe you know, a monument in Arlington Cemetery. The President of the United States, Bill Clinton, came to speak, as we have always had presidents and senators come, and this was, I guess, on the 10th anniversary, and he said, we want to have this trial. It'll be in the Netherlands somehow. They didn't know how it was going to work out. But he also said that if anyone is found guilty, they will serve their time in Scotland. They won't serve their time back in Libya. And that was the deal. Some of the families still were unhappy, but we said, okay, if that's the deal, we'll go ahead with the trial. It was a very small measure of justice. We know that there was a lot more people involved than this one fellow.
One of the 2 Libyans was released for lack of evidence. The other, Abdelbaset al-Megrahi, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Gaddafi also agreed to pay $10 million to each of the Lockerbie victims' families. The DC-10 case also had to be dealt with. Some Libyan agents were wanted by the French.
La Libye est en train de décider si oui ou non elle allait répondre aux demandes de l'ONU et notamment décider d'extrader les citoyens libyens qui sont accusés d'avoir participé à des attentats. Est-ce que la Libye a pris cette décision?
نعرف يعني استغفلت أو استدرج الرئيس الفرنسي في مسألة البنام مع أمريكا وبريطانيا فورط فرنسا ضد ليبيا بدون وعي للعلاقة بين ليبيا وبين فرنسا وبين فرنسا واتحاد المغرب العربي اللي تعتبر ليبيا هي أهم عضو.
Gaddafi's reply illustrates how he pushed successive French governments into a solution that spared him any pain. In March 1999, a Paris court convicted 6 Libyans, including Gaddafi's brother-in-law, and sentenced them to life in prison, but in absentia.
Maintenant, on espère que Kadhafi va admettre la vérité et qu'il va, ainsi qu'il avait promis, faire appliquer la sentence, même si c'est un procès par contumace.
Nous, il y avait alors un sentiment un peu euphorique de victoire. Ça y est, on a pris une première étape, on a obtenu la condamnation. Bon, on a l'impression qu'on a, ça y est, l'État français voulait un dossier béton, il a son dossier béton, à lui de poursuivre. On a eu des tas de ministres et de présidents qui sont venus chaque fois nous dire la main sur la poitrine, on va vous défendre jusqu'au bout, etc., c'est impardonnable. Et là, une défausse complète. On suspend les sanctions côté français, donc c'est annoncé au mois d'août, en pleine vacances, juste avant le 10e anniversaire de l'attentat. La messe est dite, la France se défausse et laisse tomber complètement les familles.
Ça dépend si on se place sur le plan moral ou sur le plan, on va dire, du droit international ou de la relation internationale. En termes politiques, à ce moment-là, on considère que Kadhafi a fait, j'allais dire, ce qu'on attendait de lui. Que les familles n'y trouvent pas leur compte sur le plan affectif. Et que mes propos aient pu, à ce moment-là, apparaître un peu trop realpolitique. Je le comprends.
Libya was sentenced to pay a derisory sum, between 1,500 and 30,000 euros per victim. On the 5th of April 1999, France followed the United States in agreeing to suspend the United Nations sanctions. But the unilateral American embargo remained in force. There were still a few scores to be settled. In a Geneva hotel, for the first time in 20 years, a US official met a Libyan official. The Libyan was the powerful intelligence chief Moussa Koussa.
Well, I didn't do it with any great excitement or delight. Moussa Koussa was a man who, from my point of view, had blood on his hands, had been involved in directing terrorist activities and assassinations. I want to make clear that I wasn't acting as a cowboy here. It was approved by the President and the Secretary of State. It was highly compartmentalized. Very few people knew about it in the administration. We did not tell our British allies. They were unaware of it.
The US envoy wanted a show of good faith from the Libyans. At the time, the Clinton administration was sponsoring the Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
We put certain demands on the table up front. The first was to open a separate discussion, a kind of subcommittee of the talks, if you like, with our intelligence officials to make sure that they were no longer supporting the Palestinian radicals who was housing in Libya at the time. He had a couple of training camps there. And this, if he shut them down, that would help Arafat and those who were engaged in making peace with Israel.
A few days later, Libya expelled the Abu Nidal group. In February 2000, the United States relaxed its sanctions. Gaddafi could now hope to cast off his pariah status and see US companies return. That would guarantee investment and underwrite the stability of his regime. Or so he thought. Dealing with a democracy can have some drawbacks for a dictator. When George W. Bush succeeded Bill Clinton, the American political landscape changed completely. The new president admired Ronald Reagan and disliked Gaddafi. To him, Libya was a terrorist state, along with Iraq and North Korea. His administration focused less on diplomacy than Clinton's had done.
In Entering the White House, Libya was hardly on the radar screen for the Bush administration. Clearly, Libya was still under severe sanctions. From time to time, someone would come and say that there had been efforts to move relations forward. I was vaguely aware that in the Clinton administration there had been some discussions. Those were, it seemed to us, had not gone very far.
America discovered, in the most brutal way, a new public enemy number one. Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden, were Gaddafi's mortal enemies. He'd been hunting them for years.
On est donc clairement dans un moment de tension internationale fort. Kadhafi a condamné les attentats du 11 septembre. Il me dit à ce moment-là qu'il avait mis en garde contre Al-Qaïda. Et nous, à l'Occident, procès d'avoir soutenu Ben Laden dans d'autres circonstances et sur d'autres théâtres d'opération.
It must have been a very comfortable feeling to be able to say, for example, that Libya had issued through Interpol a warrant for the arrest of bin Laden 2 years before the Americans did.
Al-Qaeda had tried to kill him on several occasions before 9/11. The Libyans were already cooperating with us on counter-terrorism, and indeed that had begun many years before. And the line the Libyans had taken was that we in the West were steadily underestimating the threat posed by Al-Qaeda. They warned us many times that we were not taking this threat seriously enough.
Gaddafi had sounded the alarm, but the White House now had every country linked to terrorism in its sights. So the colonel did whatever he could to efface his previous notoriety. He sent his intelligence chiefs to London to offer to help the West. It was yesterday's terrorists versus the terrorists of today.
When the Libyans actually came and their intelligence people were prepared to cooperate in the fight against terrorism, sure, it was strange, but I was aware that the event of September the 11th was indeed producing different reactions and different alliances.
At this point, there was no doubt, in the Leninist phrase, you know, you're either with us or you're against us. And that was true for the whole international community.
It was in those very first days after 9/11, the first weeks after 9/11, of course you were looking to see who was on the side of Al-Qaeda and who was not. And the fact that Libya denounced Al-Qaeda was an important signal.
The Libyans were experts on international terrorism. In a central London hotel, they gave Western intelligence services thousands of documents on Islamist networks in Europe and around the world.
I think it would be fair to say that Libya was probably our most valuable counter-terrorism partner in that region. The Libyans had been studying Al-Qaeda for some years, obviously, and I remember on one occasion I took the members of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee to meet Musa Kusa, and he gave them a briefing about what sort of people Al-Qaeda were. And it was one of the most compelling and instructive briefings I had ever heard. I don't think I have seen a bunch of members of Parliament so quiet and attentive on any other occasion. He described how an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber would feel if he or she was present in the room with us and was about to blow us up.
Intelligence people, because those links were there and were maintained, were very pleased to have anyone who could give them information on Al-Qaeda. And of course, Libya also was a link to other parts of the Maghreb. And obviously Al-Qaeda was very active in other parts of the Maghreb.
Libya became a zealous ally in the war on terror, in turning Al-Qaeda suspects brought in by the CIA and ruthlessly repressing its own Islamists.
This attack has been used to the utmost by the regime in Libya. Everyone now in the Arab world, in Libya, is arresting people, imprisoning people, torturing people in the name of fighting terrorism. So Gaddafi has used it. When we know that a lot of, or most of the incidents that happened in Libya in recent years, they have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda whatsoever.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
Gaddafi would have been well pleased by George Bush's State of the Union address in January 2002. One country was absent from the list of America's enemies.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. Our war against terror is only beginning.
But Gaddafi also noted the warning that America would not tolerate the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Since the mid-1990s, in the utmost secrecy and with the help of Pakistani and North Korean scientists, Gaddafi had been spending millions of dollars on a program designed to shield him permanently from his enemies. Gaddafi wanted the holy grail of every despot: nuclear weapons. But in 2003, events conspired against him. America was on the warpath, preparing to attack Iraq and another dictator, Saddam Hussein, citing weapons of mass destruction. That wasn't all. In Washington, Pentagon hardliners were planning action against all the region's dictatorships, including Libya. Alarmed, Gaddafi called Tony Blair.
Well, I remember very, very well the days in 2003, and we were very much at that time caught up with the Iraq War, and we had a lot going on. So I remember it as almost coming out of the blue. The Brits say that they have been approached by Colonel Gaddafi, who wants to discuss giving up his weapons of mass destruction. Now, if you can imagine the surprise that this was to us, we said, well, of course, you have to explore that, but what does that mean?
During the call I had with Colonel Gaddafi, the important thing was to get a sense of the sincerity of what he was doing. And so the important thing was to understand why Libya wanted to do this. Was this because, you know, there we were taking action in Afghanistan, we were taking action on Iraq, and therefore were they going then to be worried?
Would the Libyans have felt worried by the possibility that the Americans might look at them and consider them as a military target? I assume yes. They had been bombed, after all, by the Americans before. I think the Bush administration made it very clear that on this question of international terrorism, either you were against it or you weren't. But there was no middle way.
Negotiations began in a London hotel in April 2003. The meeting was kept secret, even within US government circles, to avoid interference by administration hawks who might oppose any talks with Libya.
This was done at a very, very high level. It was the president, myself as the National Security Advisor, the Deputy National Security Advisor. I kept Colin Powell informed. I would doubt that below that level, very many people knew. And so it was a very, very closely held secret. When we started to learn how much the Libyans had, particularly on the nuclear side, the centrifuges that were there, and sophisticated centrifuges, not so-called P1, but P2 centrifuges, very sophisticated, we were really quite surprised.
That, of course, was the concern at this point in time, that they would make a gesture of giving up their program, but they would not disclose and give up the whole program. They would, if you will, hedge their bets, try to get the benefits of giving up the program without really having come clean. And this was the concern that the people involved had been. So we began to ask the Libyans to begin to make some disclosures that would show their bona fides in this process. And then we would compare that with our own intelligence. And in the initial weeks, it was clear that they were withholding some information.
That week, Gaddafi tried to play for time. With the Americans bogged down in Iraq, he still hadn't given up entirely on getting the bomb. Even as the negotiations were underway in London, a large consignment of nuclear technology was heading for Libya on board the German container ship BBC China. But on the 4th of October, the ship was intercepted. Commandos seized 1,000 nuclear centrifuges.
I, to this day, don't quite understand what was going on with the Libyans in terms of whether they intended to negotiate away certain of their weapons programs and try then to backfill or to create new weapons programs.
That it would be quite in character to have played a double game like that. It's perfect. He is a conspirator by temperament. He's always trying to play a complicated game. Some simple games don't appeal to him too much.
The Proliferation Security Initiative, which quite, in a sense, innocently, quite apart from these negotiations, intercepts this ship. And the shipment is clearly headed for Libya. And I think at that point, we went to the Libyans and said, all right, what is going on here? You really, if you're making a choice to get rid of your weapons of mass destruction, this doesn't give us any confidence that, in fact, that's the case. The Libyans claimed that this was something that had happened without the knowledge of the leadership, that they, too, had kept the negotiations very compartmentalized, so perhaps people in their government didn't know that they were giving up their weapons of mass destruction.
The message we sent to Gaddafi, you got to not give it up or you've got to give it all up. But there's going to be no halfway house. One, it's unacceptable to us, and secondly, you won't be able to sustain it because we will find out one way or the other.
An agreement was finally signed at the Travelers Club on the 16th of December 2003, exactly 3 days after the capture of Saddam Hussein. According to several members of his entourage, the images of the former Iraqi dictator strongly affected Gaddafi. One point in the agreement was particularly important for the British Prime Minister and the US President. The Libyans had to make a public statement.
I had been sent various instructions about what the Libyans had undertaken to say, who was going to say it in what order, after which Mr. Blair would make a broadcast from a studio which had been set up near his constituency in the north of England.
And after that statement was released, then President Bush and Prime Minister Blair were to go on television and welcome this and so forth. And the day of the announcement came, and we kept waiting, and we kept waiting, and we kept waiting. No statement, no statement, no statement.
And the evening when this announcement was scheduled to be made, there was a football match on in Tripoli between Al-Ahli and Ittihad, the two leading Tripoli teams, and it went into extra time. So the broadcasts were delayed, and I was getting telephone calls in my residence from number 10 Downing Street in London saying, what's happened? We have to tell the Prime Minister whether he should go to the studio or not. So I said, well, what's happened at the moment is it's Al-Ahli 2, Ittihad 1, and I'll tell you when there is some further news.
Finally, the call came.
Late that evening, the Libyan Minister of Foreign Affairs addressed the media. Gaddafi had refused to do it himself.
فقد قررت الجماهيرية بإرادتها الحرة التخلص من هذه المواد والمعدات والبرامج وأن تكون خالية تماما من الأسلحة المحظورة دوليا وبناء على المحادثات التي أجرتها الجماهيرية العربية الليبية الشعبية الاشتراكية العظمى والولايات المتحدة والمملكة المتحدة.
This evening, Colonel Gaddafi has confirmed that Libya has in the past sought to develop weapons of mass destruction capabilities.
Good evening. I've called you here today to announce a development of great importance in our continuing effort to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi,
has now declared its intention to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction completely.
Libya can regain a secure and respected place among the nations.
That night, Bush and Blair called each other with congratulations. They had won big in a political poker game. At the very time when it was becoming clear that Saddam Hussein had had no weapons of mass destruction.
Now, you know, Gaddafi is not Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a leader, and him and his two sons, that there was no evidence whatever that they were changing their path. Gaddafi, on the contrary, who in my view is a different type of leader altogether, had decided that whatever the past was, he was going to have a different type of future.
Well, it was a tremendous breakthrough to have a country give up its weapons of mass destruction, a country that had been isolated for almost 30 years to suddenly decide that it wanted to re-enter. It was a huge political and foreign policy victory.
And it's ironical, of course, that we thought, we were convinced that Saddam Hussein was hiding his WMD, and we didn't know that Gaddafi had nuclear capability. For Bush, it was important partly because we couldn't find the WMD in Iraq, but because he had argued in going to war that there would be a ripple effect, that taking out one bad guy, very bad guy, would impact on the behaviour of others. And so here was the first place where he could demonstrate the ripple effect was actually working.
And one of the things we self-consciously did was to go to the North Koreans and show and urge upon them the Libyan example. And we even urged the Libyans to be in contact with the North Koreans and make the same case. I don't know whether they ever did or not.
Then we had to make sure, which is why the normalization, or the road to normalization, was important, that Libya was indeed rewarded for having given up its weapons of mass destruction. Because if it looked as if Libya gave up its weapons of mass destruction and got nothing in return, then why would a country do this?
Neither Iran nor North Korea followed suit. The Libyan case, riddled with entangled interests, bluff and realpolitik, was unique. But the rewards came quickly. A congressional delegation visited Libya, and President Bush granted the Libyan government immunity from all legal action pertaining to terrorism. Gaddafi's criminal record was wiped clean.
Last and probably least, it is our custom to give a coin.
من عادتنا أن نترك عملة تذكارية.
Perhaps someday you will come and address Congress.
هذه من تقاليدنا ربما تزورون في يوم من الأيام.
Thank you very much.
His mood was very good, and I saw him, he was joking with people. He was in very good mood because he felt that his worst fear was that the Americans would betray him. They would promise him things, and then they would lie to him, and then they would try to overthrow him and all that. He felt that all of that was gone.
وقت الكفاح كفاح، ووقت السلام سلام، ووقت المنافع منافع. اللي بعد تنتهي المعركة يبدأ يرمي في الرصاص يمين ويسار، هذا مجنون. خلاص لما انتهت المعركة واحتليت الهدف، هزمت العدو، ألقي السلاح.
I believe it helped him recuperate the economy and to give him more legitimacy internally, because when he was totally isolated, even by the Arabs, his legitimacy internally began to fade. So the West helped him regain that.
I think if people had thought that if we had not opened up to Libya, it would have brought down the regime and the end of tyranny, and it resulted in a democratic and free Libya. That certainly would have been an argument that we would have heard in our deliberations. But nobody really made that case. This is a guy who's been around for a long time, and there is not much of an opposition, my understanding.
Towards the end of 2003, the US voted to lift all sanctions on Libya. So did France. Following an intensive media battle waged by the families, Gaddafi agreed to pay $1 million per victim of the DC-10 bombing. The same assembly that had voted for an embargo on Libya 10 years earlier now pronounced Gaddafi officially acceptable. The former pariah had survived. He was still in power. But he wanted more. He wanted respect, prestige, and to get his own back on those who had forced him into humiliating concessions. Once the sanctions were lifted, world leaders flocked to pay court in Tripoli. Gaddafi had called for these visits, which made him a player on the world stage. With Libya now owning the 8th largest oil reserve, as well as large natural gas reserves, everyone sought his favors. Gaddafi even received the US Secretary of State. On the agenda, commerce and the war on terror. Tony Blair, architect of the West's rapprochement with Libya, signed billions of dollars in contracts for Shell and BP.
We sat and we talked, and once you talk with someone face to face and you engage with them, you're able to judge whether this is real or not, and I judged that it was. Some people sort of say, well, politicians shouldn't do that. I say, absolutely they should if they're trying to help their own business. So it's not something I have any difficulty with. On the contrary, I think it's the right thing for us to do. and every other European and the American countries do it too.
3 years after Tony Blair's visit, Gaddafi and his son Saif obtained the compassionate release of the only Libyan serving a life sentence for the Lockerbie bombing. Officially, he was released on health grounds.
حقيقة وأيضا تقال للمرة الأولى كل الصفقات التجارية والنفطية والغاز واللي في تلك الفترة واللي أشرفنا عليها أن تكون دائما موجود على الطاولة. فكانت كل المصالح البريطانية لما تجي ليبيا أنت دائما كنت تحط فيك على الطاولة، وبشكل شخصي كنت أشرف على هذا الموضوع.
We had to make it very clear it wasn't a decision for the government, and it wasn't, because the power was devolved and there's a whole set of systems that come into place on this decision. But obviously for them, for Libya, just as it was a very sensitive issue for our public opinion, it was a very sensitive issue for theirs.
I don't know when it would have become part of the negotiation and when it was on the table, but you know, you may well be right. It may well have been there in 2003. But it's certainly not something that I was aware of at the time at all.
We got one of the terrorists convicted, and then the British acted in a perfidious way and let him out. By the way, I don't think he ever did die, so I suspect that health excuse was just that, an excuse. And we had very clear understandings, at least we thought we did, with the Brits that he would not be let out if he was convicted and sentenced.
Gaddafi was rich. He bought roads, factories, airports, and a lot of weapons. At the request of the Europeans, he stemmed the tide of would-be African migrants who were crossing Libya bound for Europe. The West pandered to him. He used that to exact his revenge. For years, 7 Bulgarian nurses and a Palestinian doctor had been held in a Libyan jail, accused of inoculating children with the AIDS virus. Their ordeal moved public opinion and upset the rapprochement between Libya and the West. But Gaddafi wouldn't budge. Emissaries were sent to free them. The European Commission held long negotiations. Gaddafi upped the ante.
Er ist ein ausgezeichneter Verhandler, der zwar auf der einen Seite über den Dingen steht und diese also beobachtet, der aber ganz genau die Fäden zieht. Auf der anderen Seite glaube ich nicht, dass es reine Rache war, sondern es war sowohl eine Koinzidenz, die er aber auch nützte. Was er wirklich wollte, ist mit großem Stolz aus dieser Affäre auszusteigen und zu zeigen, auch ich kann großzügig sein, aber ihr müsst mir entgegenkommen und ihr müsst mich eigentlich wieder mit Prestige in die Weltgemeinschaft und in die europäische Gemeinschaft sozusagen als Partner mit aufnehmen und anerkennen. Das, glaube ich, war für ihn sehr wesentlich.
In July 2007, Gaddafi granted France the privilege of bringing the nurses home. Alongside the European Commissioner was President Sarkozy's former wife, Cecilia, symbolizing the victory of French diplomacy. In exchange, France had promised sophisticated weapons and, above all, an official visit to Paris.
Ich glaube, sowohl Gaddafi als auch Frankreich konnten hier sozusagen einen diplomatischen Coup landen. Und selbstverständlich war das beiden eigentlich sehr angenehm. Ich glaube, dass vor allem die Libyer selber, als das Abkommen ausverhandelt war, herumgefahren sind und sozusagen ausprobiert haben, in welcher Hauptstadt würden sie das eigentlich erreichen, was sie wollten, nämlich eben Prestige, Rückkehr in die internationale Gemeinschaft mit möglichst viel Gloire.
For the first time since the end of the embargo, Gaddafi was welcomed on the soil of a Western country and accorded rare honors. He spent 6 days in Paris, bringing entire streets to a standstill. He invited himself to the Louvre and to Versailles. He pitched his tent in the public gardens. This lavish official visit began on International Human Rights Day, sparking protests.
We went to France to demonstrate, and the French police, after they have given us permission to demonstrate, they stopped us from demonstrating, and not only that, they put us on a bus and they took us to a police station for 8 hours on the day of the anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration. It's unbelievable.
J'ai dit au président Kadhafi combien il fallait continuer à progresser sur le chemin des droits de l'homme, dans tous ses aspects, tout ce qu'il restait à faire.
Le président Nicolas Sarkozy a indiqué hier qu'il vous avait demandé de progresser sur le chemin des droits de l'homme.
Tout d'abord, nous n'avons pas évoqué, moi et le président Sarkozy, ces sujets. Nous sommes amis et proches collaborateurs.
Ça n'a pas été évoqué.
Pas du tout, absolument pas. Nous avons évoqué les questions de coopération entre les deux pays. Nous avons évoqué tous ces contrats dans différents domaines et dans l'intérêt des deux pays.
Gaddafi demonstrated his renewed power by humiliating his host. He failed to honor most of the 10 billion euros worth of contracts he had promised, such as one for Rafale fighter planes. On the 19th of September 2009, Gaddafi followed President Obama in addressing the UN General Assembly.
Why we failed to pass on...
Thanks to solid diplomatic support in the Third World, his country would preside over the UN General Assembly for a year. The same UN that had placed him under embargo.
هل المقاعد الدائمة هل نحن متساويين فيها؟ أبدا غير متساويين من برا الخطابة فقط زي ما تخطب في حديقة هاي.
Instead of the scheduled 35 minutes, Gaddafi monopolized the floor for 1.5 hours and ended by tossing the UN Charter aside. There was no formal diplomatic reaction to this insult. 17 months later, much to the surprise of the West, Gaddafi's regime was on the point of collapse. Realpolitik led the West to believe that Gaddafi's dictatorship would go on forever. And Gaddafi, convinced that rapprochement with the West would guarantee his survival, underestimated the wrath of his own people.
If you're passionate about documentaries, go online to view more programs, read articles and join the discussion at sbs.com.au/documentary.